Hello class. In this lecture we're going to take a pretty detailed look at the causes of the Civil War. This lecture is meant to kind of introduce you to a lot of the main causes for the war, as well as provide you as kind of a review that will go along with the book, with the textbook for the class and anything else that we do in class, whether it's videos, projects, or primary sources that we'll take a look at. This does not cover everything, but it does cover the main actions that led to the causes of the war, and is pretty detailed for what we're going to do. Alright, so let's get started in our causes. So we're going to first start with the Missouri Compromise. I did not want to start earlier. We could look back to even earlier than 1776, saying that roots were started for the cause of our Civil War. Eventually. But I kind of wanted to focus within our periods that we're looking at in our AP curriculum, and not to give you guys too much to look back on. Now we will look at some of the issues of slavery in a later lesson, and in a little bit in this lecture too. But let's start with the Missouri Compromise. Alright, with that said, the Missouri Compromise was passed on May 8th, 1820. It was very significant as a form of legislation for our country, as it outlawed slavery in all lands north of the parallel of 3630, with the exception of Missouri, which is why it's called the Missouri Compromise. Now, the two main aspects of the compromise itself were that it focused on making sure that the slave states versus the free states were even. The country itself was fighting politically, trying to keep that division equal. And this compromise did so. You have Missouri here entering as a slave state, with Maine entering as free. And with this compromise in the years after, the idea was that if a state would enter into the Union, if it was north of that line, it would be free, and if it was south of the line, it had the option for slavery, with the added bonus, or at least the thought in the South, that if they were going to add a free state, they would also add a slave state at the same time. Now, the advantage of the Missouri Compromise is it did help quell a lot of the sectional debates in Congress and the sectional debates that divided our nation. But one thing it did is it made sure to legitimize slavery as a pure Southern institution, being that nothing above the line of 3630 could be slave. So that was a step. Even though it did have its benefits initially, it was a step in the direction of division later on, especially in the events that we're going to talk about here coming up. Alright, here again you can see the map of the Missouri Compromise a little bit clearer. Again, you have there in red the line of 3630. Now if you look there, Delaware, Maryland, Virginia, and Kentucky, yes, they're above it, but they were states before the compromise. So that is why you see their slave states above that line beforehand. Alright, now let's go to the next one, the nullification crisis. This is a very detailed situation, so I'm only going to give you the highlights of it. But essentially what happened is there were a lot of economic tariffs that had come out of the War of 1812, and the South was starting to really struggle because there were some economic problems going on in the periods of after 1820, and the South thought that, in particular South Carolina thought that with the election of Andrew Jackson, that the tariff rules would be changed. Now that did not happen, and essentially what happened in South Carolina is radical political figures started to declare that the tariff of 1828, which affected their trade, was null and void within the state, and that the federal government didn't have any say in to be able to enforce that. Now that split was huge because Andrew Jackson wanted to focus on nationalist rights, and his vice president, who was from South Carolina, John C. Calhoun, who you can see there on the bottom left, wanted states' rights, and Calhoun actually threatened resignation. He eventually would resign, but before he could do so, Jackson tried to pass a new tariff in 1832 to please those and try to please those Southerners and try to end the crisis. It did help please a lot in the South and some businessmen in the Northeast, but South Carolina was the exception. And they passed a few months later what they called the Ordinance of Nullification, declaring that those tariffs were unconstitutional within the state and could not be enforced. Now, this went on for a few months, back and forth between the national government and the state government of South Carolina, with the eventuality of the national government in the form of Congress passing two bills on the same day. One was the Force Bill and the Compromise Bill, or Compromise Tariff, of 1833. And the Force Bill stated that Jackson could use troops against South Carolina, but South Carolina agreed to the Compromise Tariff, and they ended up repealing their nullification. Now, the effects were positive both for the nation and more for South Carolina, that the tariff rates were reduced, and it helped with their trade, which is what they wanted all along. But the semi-negative is that states' rights were strengthened, which led to more pushback against the government in the actions that we're going to see here coming up, especially when it came to threats of slavery. So it's going to help, just like the Missouri Compromise, but it's going to lead and cause, or at least lay the groundwork for division. All right, states' rights. This is kind of a generalized slide because it comes up in everything that we really talk about, just like slavery before the war. Basically, states' rights is the idea that the states themselves individually had more power than the federal government, and they had the right to make the decisions. Now, this position was mainly held in the South. I mean, it was held in some northern states, but it was mostly a southern idea. And it was set up that way because the states wanted more power so that they could actually offset certain issues. In particular, the big one was the growing disparity between the population of the northern states and the southern states, as well as the economic differences as well. One of the examples we've already covered is the Three-Fifths Compromise, to try to adjust that so that the states such as, let's say, Alabama or South Carolina, Georgia, with the Three-Fifths Compromise, that was a states' right idea that was pushed forward by our national government to kind of even out that population disparity, to make sure that the national government, which was mostly northern-led, or what Southerners feared would eventually be, from taking too much control. All right, the Compromise of 1850. Okay, now the Compromise of 1850 basically came about because of the Mexican-American War. Out of that war, as you guys know, we gained quite a few territories. Well, those territories, if you were to go back, and we'll see a map here in just a minute, were not part of the United States, or even in any form, whether it was part of the Louisiana Purchase or not, before the Mexican-American War, so they weren't part of the Missouri Compromise, even though you have the lines of 3630. So basically what went on is you had sectional tensions that were increased because the question of what to do with these lands, even with the idea of North and South above that line of 3630, but there was a proviso put forward, and it got the name of Wilmot Proviso after its drafter, that basically stated that all this territory that's gained by Mexico from the war should ban slavery in these territories. And it was a northern backed idea. And so the South, again, feeling the threat against their way of life, their economy, their institution of slavery, had to enter into some kind of compromise. Now, the compromise itself basically stated that California was free, the entire territory of it, as well as Utah and New Mexico, which were territories, not states, were undecided. Basically, they could come up with their own idea and have popular sovereignty. Texas's size was reduced. The slave trade was also outlawed in D.C., although slavery wasn't outlawed. You just couldn't continue to trade. And kind of the benefit for the South is they got a stronger fugitive slave law out of the deal, because California actually was free south of the line of 3630. So there's some inconsistency with the Missouri Compromise, with the Compromise of 1850. So that again kind of fueled a little bit of sectionalism or division in our country, but at the same time, just like nullification in the Missouri Compromise, it helped stave off some issues while at the same time causing some. So it delays things temporarily, and it reignites, specifically in 1850 with the new fugitive slave law, the question of slavery, and puts it more at the forefront, even though for the most part in the 30 years beforehand it wasn't a huge issue, with a few exceptions like Nat Turner's Rebellion and others. Okay, here again, here's the Compromise of 1850. Okay, again, you can see here you have your free states to the north, you have your slave states to the south of the line of 3630, and then you have the determination. But again, the line of 3630 crosses here. We don't have it on this map, but you can see California goes below that, so that is an inconsistency. All right, just a few more. I know this is a little bit long one, but I hope this helps. So the Kansas-Nebraska Act, is next, and it basically created the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, which would become those states. Nebraska would be a little bit more, and Kansas would be part of the Kansas territory, would also be part of Colorado as well. But basically, it was there. It started for farming rights, which was not a point of contention. Both sides liked it, whether they were pro-slavery or anti-slavery. The problem was, in this territory was again north of the line of 3630, is that this act was put forward by Stephen Douglas, and it said in it the people, not the federal government, should decide all questions pertaining to slavery. Now that was key, because basically it effectively repealed the idea of the Missouri Compromise, in saying that, kind of going with the states' right idea, that the people, not the federal government, have the right to make that decision. So what happened is all the settlers that were going into these territories, in particular more in Kansas than in Nebraska, they started a rush to get their own territory, own town set up, and try to get legislation within the territory to where they could get that state to become slave or free, depending on who they are. And it actually led to conflict, which we'll talk a little bit more about on I think next slide or the one after, called Bleeding Kansas. And basically the effects is it increased the tensions again over the questions of slavery, as well as states' rights, because of that idea that the people, not the federal government, should make that decision. It also led to the formation of the Republican Party, because of the divisions politically within the Democratic Party and the Whigs at the time, and then Bleeding Kansas, which I said we'll talk about. All right, here again you can see the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and you can see this opening territory, the parts from the Mexican-American War, as well as the remaining parts from the Louisiana Purchase, are still up to determination by popular sovereignty. All right, just a few more. So what happens is the Republican Party, like I said, it develops out of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and basically the disintegration of the Whig Party. Now the Whig Party is not going to completely go away, but for all intents and purposes, it's no longer a strong entity politically. So now you have a vacuum for another party to come in. And they run on the platform, depending on where they're at, of either free soil, so anti-slavery or abolitionist, or free labor. And the free labor part was huge, because that meant a lot of popularity with those that worked in the northern cities, because the North was very urban in a lot of areas, and they wanted free labor. They wanted the ability to work. And that gained a lot of popularity in the northern cities. Now, that's in terms of the Republicans. But further fragmentation, Bleeding Kansas was that conflict between pro-slavery, pro-slavery settlers into Kansas and Nebraska, and free soilers, okay, anti-slavery abolitionists. And it was basically a short, I say short, but it lasted several years, of guerrilla-style warfare between both sides. Matter of fact, the pro-slavery faction even was able to pass a constitution, but the Free Soilers with a majority or a minority were able to end that. And there's it's very complicated. We won't get into it, but there was a lot of killing on both sides. In particular, John Brown actually led a band of men as abolitionists and killed several with broadswords in the Bleeding Kansas incidents. But more on John Brown here in a little bit. And then from a fragmentation standpoint, politically, in the campaign of 1856, it just all pretty much focused on slavery. There weren't really any other questions that were brought up, which meant that this issue, whether it was from the compromises we've talked about to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, was at the forefront, and it was just continuing to drive a wedge between everybody. And whether you were pro-national or pro-state or pro-slavery or anti-slavery, it just kept getting driven in terms of a wedge. All right, now another fragmentation event is Dred Scott, and those of you guys that have taken government are probably very familiar with this case. But Dred Scott was a slave who was asking for freedom because his master had moved from a slave state north, I believe, to Wisconsin, which was free, and he viewed that by the actions of our government previously with the Missouri Compromise and other pieces of legislation, that he should be free because he was in a free state. Now, the decision that was made by a states' rights justice, Roger B. Taney, which you guys will read a primary source from, or have the choice to, he made the decisions that Negroes were not and or could not be citizens based on what was stated in our Constitution, and that the federal government did not have the power to regulate slavery. Okay, sorry for the little typo there. So essentially what happened with this case is it furthered that question of slavery more, put it more in the national forefront because it was a Supreme Court case, and it angered all northern abolitionists / anti-slavery supporters. And instead of actually deciding the question of slavery, which is what the Chief Justice Roger Taney thought he was doing with his ruling, and for all intents and purposes, it ruled the Missouri Compromise unconstitutional. So back to our first thing that we talked about, the institution that was supposed to decide things, which has been solely chipped away at in the other events or actions, is now pretty much just gone because of this ruling. And it further divides our country. All right, just a couple more. Increasing tensions. All right, so after 1856, we had some further issues within our political parties. Now this time in terms of the Republican Party, you have the famous Lincoln-Douglas debates, which again, you guys will have the options to read a speech from both of those two men, which was put at the forefront of our national discussion, national politics. And it was a question over popular sovereignty. Should people have the right to decide in their state, should they be slave or free, or should it be a national law? Our national idea. Now Douglas focused more on popular sovereignty. He's the one that pioneered and worked on the Kansas-Nebraska Act, and Lincoln looked at it in a different way. Now Douglas did beat Lincoln, although we don't really look at that in history because Lincoln's going to become president in 4 years. But Douglas wins, Lincoln raises his national profile. Now furthermore, in 1857 there was another economic crisis that led to increased tensions across the board in our politics, and it led to strengthening of the Republican Party because remember, they had that idea of free labor. So that was a huge thing for the Republican Party, especially in a time of economic crisis and with the majority of the wealth being in the North. Now in 1859, I told you we'd talk about John Brown again, the abolitionist. He was in Kansas, now he's going to go into Virginia, what is West Virginia now, and they're going to raid, he and several followers are going to raid Harper's Ferry, which is a U.S. armory. And his goal was he wanted to capture the armory, use the supplies there, gunpowder, weapons, food, as well as some other things, to start a slave revolt throughout the entire South to completely take down the institution of slavery. And unfortunately for him, the raid failed. He was lauded as a hero, kind of somewhat almost like folk hero in the North in some respects because of what he was trying to do. And in the South, he was vilified. He was executed, hung after this event. But again, it just served to increase the tensions, and the question at the forefront was slavery. But still, states' rights and popular sovereignty was still there as well. All right. So the election of 1860 is where we're at. Now, the election of 1860 is very interesting. You have the Republicans, they nominate Abraham Lincoln because he was less controversial than some of the other candidates they put forward. Now, and people liked him from the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Now, here's the issue for the election, and it caused it to really make it the way it went. It made it easy, really, for Abraham Lincoln. The Democrats split because of the ideas of differences between states' rights, as well as the idea between slavery and popular sovereignty and all that stuff, between Stephen Douglas, who we just talked about, as well with the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and he's in our upper right-hand corner here, and John C. Breckinridge, who was a Southern Democrat. So they had a basically split ticket. And they were really the only ones that could, the Democratic Party was the really only ones that could fight back against the Republicans, but they split themselves. And then John Bell, who ran as the Constitutional Union Party, was also a Southerner from Tennessee, so that further helped split the ticket as well, leading to an easy Lincoln victory. And here's where the effects that kind of send it down to where the war happens, at least the final event in some ways. Before the firing on Fort Sumter. The southern states start to secede afterwards. And you guys will read some things about how the South felt towards the North, and we'll touch on a little bit of things in general after this one to finish up. But they started to secede because of that issue, or the questions over the two overlying issues: slavery and states' rights. Okay, now at first, this secession actually with South Carolina as well as a couple of other states happened before Lincoln even took office. James Buchanan was still the president, and then Lincoln became president. They actually denied to recognize the new Confederate States of America. Now, after a couple of months, Lincoln actually called for more troops, with the idea that he might have to quell something or use them. Well, that further led to more states seceding, and that ultimately led to the war between the North and the South. All right, and here's your electoral map of 1860. Sorry, I think I said Bell took... no, I did say Bell took Tennessee. But you can see here, Breckinridge is in the South, completely outside of Maryland and Delaware. Bell took Virginia as well as Tennessee and Kentucky, and then you have Douglas only taking Missouri and half on a split ticket in New Jersey. So you can kind of see itself basically how the Democratic ticket, especially with you add in Bell, affected the election. All right, two kind of general ones to kind of sum up some ideas for causes. All right, so basically some of the reasons between reasons why there was a division in the North and the South. First off, the North was much more populous and urbanized than the South. It was more focused on cities, where the South was more rural and based on farms and plantations. So there was a completely different kind of mindset there, and less people in the South. And that meant a lot, specifically in terms of voting with the House of Representatives and your percentages. That's hence the 3/5 compromise that we've talked about earlier in this lecture and earlier in the course. Excuse me. All right. Now, also, besides that, the majority of the country's wealth, as well as technology and the transportation base, particularly railroads, was based in the North, whereas the main economic functions in the South, like I said, is farming and based on slavery. So it was completely different. I think the economics we're looking at, it's like 85% to the North, 15% to the South, even though slavery was very fulfilling and rich for some. Also, in terms of a few other things, the education in the North was much more prevalent. It was still not what it was to today's standards. It was just getting started, but you had public education. You start seeing colleges pop up, or people going to college, where that really wasn't a whole lot common in the South. So you have more education in the North. Another thing too, you had immigrants that went all over our country, but there was a significant greater portion that were going to the northern cities because of work and also their familiarity with living in cities in Europe. While the South, again, its population was basically 1/3 approximately made up of slaves, so that was kind of a pushback and a negative against them as well. And then all of these differences led to cultural divides between the North and the South, to where it was difficult for people to make amends, whether it was over a simple issue or a complicated one. All right. I believe this is the last slide. Yep. Okay. So thank you for staying with me. I know this is a little bit long. All right. So abolition and slavery, we will do a lesson on this a little bit later. But basically, just to kind of touch on it a little bit, in the decades prior to the war, starting, let's say, with 1820 on, where we started, the South was focused on positions to protect slavery. Specifically, like we've seen in the Missouri Compromise, nullification, and so on. And it was basically to protect their way of life culturally, but in a lot of ways it was their economic, because slavery was the institution that boosted their economy. It was really all they had, because they didn't have a lot of cities, they didn't have a lot of factories, and their railroads were significantly less in the South than they were in the North. So it was economically, that was a huge issue for them, and why they wanted to protect slavery, as well as the idea that they think states should have more power in rights and decision making in the national government. And then furthermore, with just the abolitionist movement, I don't want to get into too big specifics just yet. They significantly grew before the war because of questions. Looking back to our Declaration of Independence, where it says all men are created equal, and then other forms of legislation and actions. Two big figures that we'll take a look at, William Lloyd Garrison and Frederick Douglass, were very important. Now, a piece of literature that I'm hoping to get you guys to read, we'll see if we can find copies, Uncle Tom's Cabin, really increased the anti-slavery and abolitionist notions once it was published, because it was a story that kind of set you into the light of what it was like to live as a slave, and that angered a lot of people, and it kind of helped start movements like the Free Soil movement in the North. And then all these questions are based on slavery, along with, like I said, slavery, our states' rights several times, were present in nearly every issue before the war. So it's a big part, and it's something that you can't forget in any of the topics that might come up, whether they were mentioned in this lecture or not. All right, guys, I hope you like that. Sorry it was a little bit long, but again, you'll be viewing this at home. So if you guys have any questions, just make sure to ask me in class tomorrow or in the upcoming days. See ya.